It's a mistake to opt your kids out of the Common Core exams. Right now in New York, we're in the middle of these exams, and I'm here to explain why this opt-out movement is completely misguided. My name's Ross Rosenfeld. I've been in education for about 13 years, including working as a New York City school teacher and operating my own tutoring business. Now, as a New York City school teacher, I saw how low the standards were, how lax they were. And I worked with a lot of poor kids, and a lot of those poor kids had pretty much no shot of escaping poverty because their education was so subpar. So now I want to get to these misconceptions and explain why they're wrong. Let's start with the idea that the test was created by quote unquote big test or companies like Pearson that were looking to make a profit. The fact of the matter is it was nonprofit organizations, especially the Gates Foundation, that were largely behind this effort. And it was an effort led by the National Governors Association. Governors from various states get together regularly, and they did so in order to discuss the problem of education in this country. And the problem is that we were falling further and further behind other industrialized nations. Countries that had been behind us were catching up and even going past us. And they also saw that we weren't getting any more college graduates, actually, than we had in the 1960s, percentage-wise. Now, this shocks a lot of people because I know that I used to think growing up that more and more people were going to college and graduating college. Well, more are going to college, but percentage-wise, no more are graduating, really. I mean, it's pretty close. Back in the 1960s, 1970s, it was around 40%, and now it's just over 40%. Now, you might say, why is this? Why are so few people graduating? Well, part of the reason has to do with debt and financial aid, but another part is that we were finding more and more often, and we're still finding, that kids were graduating high school and finding out basically that their high school diplomas were worthless because they didn't have the requisite skills they needed to succeed in college. And that's the kids, by the way, who even managed to graduate high school, which obviously not all of them do. We do them such a disservice in middle school or junior high that many of them can't even hack it in high school. But basically they'd drop out of college because they either were forced to take remedial classes and even then sometimes couldn't make it, and they just couldn't get through the work. They weren't used to having to think on their own. They didn't have the skills they needed in math and reading to survive in college. And they would try to do it for a year and then wind up dropping out, and then they have debt. So this was a problem. And that's why the National Governors Association decided, along with the Gates Foundation, who was helping, they decided that we needed better standards. We needed our kids to actually have Common Core standards that would help them get a decent education. So that's the first misconception addressed. Now, another misconception, that these standards were created without any input from teachers or professionals. That's just plainly wrong. They took a long time speaking to thousands of professionals in the field, not only teachers, but people like school psychologists and administrators. They got a lot of input, and they created these standards based on that input. Now, that leads me to another misconception, which is that the standards are somehow wrong or unfair. Granted, you could cherry pick a standard here and there that might be wrong or unfair, that might be misguided in its attempt. Including at the kindergarten and first grade level, there are some standards that are questionable developmentally, whether the children of that age can handle that particular standard, such as thinking abstractly. And we could talk about whether or not that's an appropriate standard and maybe how to improve it. But what you have to realize is that there are thousands upon thousands of standards, hundreds or more for each grade. And so if you're picking out just a few, then obviously you could make the standards look bad. But the fact of the matter is that most of the standards are completely appropriate. Now, as far as the tests themselves, because you also heard this argument that, oh, the tests are way too hard. Well, I've been through as many of these tests and as many practices as anyone probably, and I have to tell you that the tests are completely reasonable. The math test is quite a good test. The tests are fair. The big difference between this test and the test in years past is that the tests in years past basically did not require kids to think. It was almost all rote memorization, and it was frankly very easy questions. These tests have some questions that simply require memorization, but they also have questions that require doing 2 or 3 steps in order to solve a problem. That's not really asking a lot of kids. As a matter of fact, some of the questions can be solved with basic common sense. As far as the reading goes, the most of the ELA questions are completely fair. A lot of it is just being able to either go back and find something in the reading or to draw simple, basic conclusions. I think the writing component could use improvement, but that's only because it's too easy. It doesn't require kids to actually know how to spell words or use grammar or even have proper sentence structure. All the writing requirement basically asks is that they cite details and examples from whatever document they're reading. That's not a very high standard. The problem there is that the standard is too low, and that's why it doesn't accurately measure writing ability. But the fact of the matter is that the tests are very fair and very reasonable. What really happened here was that the tests were in years past far too easy, and because of that, parents thought that their kids were doing fine, and then there was this shock when they found out that in fact they weren't. But what parents should really be angry about, what they should be up in arms about, is not that the tests are now honest and fair. They should be upset that that for so long they were lied to. They were told that their kids were proficient when they weren't. They lowered the raw score requirements to reach proficiency, to reach a level of proficiency, to make it look like more kids were doing okay than they were. The truth is that the kids weren't doing okay. There's a thing called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and for years they do surveys, and they basically find out the levels of proficiency in for the states and across the country, for the nation as a whole. And they had said for a long time that New York students were right around 31, 32% when it came to proficiency in both reading and math. And our tests kept going up. They kept saying, oh, we're at 60 some odd percent, 70 some odd percent. And that's because the tests were getting easier and the raw score requirements were going down. But it was clear that it was dishonest. And now these tests are a lot more honest. And because of that, parents who don't want to admit that their child might have a problem are saying that it must be the test, that the test is unfair. This is a dangerous proposition because, for instance, you wouldn't take your son or daughter to a doctor, and if the doctor said, well, I'd like to give your son or daughter a test to determine whether or not they're sick, you wouldn't say, well, I don't want them to get that test because it could be stressful and because I could find out that something is wrong. The test is an important diagnostic tool. If your kids don't take it, you might not find out that they're having a problem for years. And this idea that the test is too stressful, which is another misconception, is again just wrong. I mean, first off, kids have to deal with stress. They have to learn how to deal with stress. If they can't deal with the stress of taking a test, then they might have greater issues than you think. They need to be able to deal with that stress. Life has stress in it. In college, they're going to be taking lots of examinations, and it's going to be some stress. And then there's this misconception that teaching to the test, so to speak, as they say, takes away from learning time. Now, I don't believe in teaching test-taking strategies per se, how to eliminate wrong answers, those types of things. I think they should get rid of that. But most of the test prep, as it's labeled, is really just basic reading and math skills, things that they need. So if that's teaching to the test, then fine. There's also this idea that somehow test taking is bad for learning. That's just not true. There's a great book out there that I read called Make It Stick. I mentioned it in one of my articles, where they pretty conclusively show that the science on this is clear, that actually quizzing kids on a regular basis, testing them on a regular basis, is a good thing. The authors of the book, by the way, wrote a piece for the New York Times where you could see a summation. And it's true that the more you quiz kids, the more you test them on things, the more they have to be on their toes. Testing is not anti-learning. Testing is an important part of learning, not just as a diagnostic tool, but also because testing reinforces learning. So that's another misconception. And then there's the idea that for some reason these tests are punitive. You constantly hear them say these are high stakes tests. Well, they may be high stakes, but they're high stakes for the schools and for the teachers, but not for the students. Let's face it, students are not getting left back anymore. These tests would only determine if those students need help. And as far as the teachers go, well, that's what accountability is. I mean, I run a tutoring business, so if anything, I'd have reason to tell the parents I work for not to have their kids take the test because it could do me damage. If the kids do poorly that I work with, I'm going to be the first person the parents turn to and say, well, we've been paying you. Why are our children doing poorly? And they'd be right because I should take some responsibility. Well, it's the same with teachers. The governor right now in New York, Andrew Cuomo, is suggesting that 50% of teacher evaluations be counted, be part of, be how their kids did on the test. And of course, the union is negotiating with him, and we'll see what they come up with. It could be anywhere between 25 and 50%, I'd say, but it's completely reasonable to want to have part of their evaluation be based on the test. You can't just base it on how the kids do in their class because they're grading those kids, and they're biased. And you can't even just count on principals per se to give them fair evaluations because a lot of times principals are compassionate people like you or I, and they want their teachers to do well. They want to train them. They want to make them better teachers. They're not necessarily going to want to fire someone. As a matter of fact, in my experience, a lot of times those evaluations by principals were done in a punitive way themselves. They wanted to get rid of certain people, they would look to get rid of them. But if they liked someone, they were staying no matter what. So this idea that somehow teachers shouldn't be held accountable is a bad idea. Now, to get to a greater issue, why were these tests, why were these standards implemented? Well, because first off, like I said, we were seeing more and more kids unprepared. But not only that, we have a growing wealth gap in this country. And there was a study that came out about a year ago that said that if you're born in the bottom 20% of the economic strata in this country, then your chances of making it to the top 20% are only about 8%. This used to be the land of opportunity, and the people who are behind the Common Core saw that slipping away. They saw that basically if you're born poor, your chances of making it out of poverty are extremely, extremely slim. And one of the few avenues that has always existed in our country to improve your chances of getting out of poverty has been education. That's the main avenue. And if you're not getting a proper education, your chances of making it out are basically non-existent. So what you have to understand if you're opting your kid out is that not only are you endangering your child's education, but you're also endangering other children's educations. Because if this effort fails, if we don't succeed in improving the standards, then it's likely that no one will try to do so again for maybe 20 or 30 years. Now, I saw those poor kids that I worked with in Brooklyn, and I saw the problems that they already had to deal with. Can't we at least make sure to get them a decent education? We can talk about ways to improve the Common Core. We can have that conversation. But the problem is the people who are opting out, the people who are against the Common Core, they're not offering an alternative. They're just trying to abolish the Common Core. They want to go back to the old standards, which are no standards. And we can't do that. We were on a sinking ship. Our system was failing. We cannot go back to the old way. Now, if anyone out there wants to address this with me, I'll be happy to talk with people about this. But can we please stop all the misinformation? Because the truth is, if this effort fails, we're all in a lot of trouble.